Don't trust what you cannot see. Touch your skin and call your name. It's just the past that looks back at me. Left your home just to get away, but you took the buses with you. Set things up just to break them down. Keeps your mind down, nothing new. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone up saviors. Government hunts them down. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone up saviors. Government hunts them down. Yeah. All that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been for, been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else. Taken. Yeah. Watching the TV, high on dope. My nights are Lucy reruns. Talk shows open, current hit. Sanctioned self-indulgent numb. Throw away what you got. Blame what's missing from your life. It's not your fault things worked out this way. It's someone's mother, daughter, wife. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone on saviors. Government hunts them down. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone on saviors. Government hunts them down. Yeah. All that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been for, been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else. Taken. Yeah.
All right, that was Ringmaster by Gloria's band, or no, that was Reflection by Gloria's band Ringmaster. And it's playing again. Right. Okay, hey everybody, I'm CheeseSlice. I'm the engineer and producer of today's show, and we've got a good one for you. We've got we're going to have a live interview with Jeff Kisseloff, who wrote a book about Adolf Hiss, or is it Albert Hiss? Man, I should have. Anyway, we're gonna go over that. This is a radio program. We're going to be recording for an hour, and we're going to have Gloria and Jayme host the show and conduct the interview. So here we go. This is Gloria. How are you? And
hey, Jayme.
This is Jayme, our resident expert. How are you guys doing?
Hey, Jayme.
And here's our guest for today, Jeff. So, Jeff, we're going to do an hour recording.
Welcome, Jeff.
It's Gloria is going to start off the show, and let's get to it.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined by our resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jayme is a professor at Tulsa Community College, historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and our guest, and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today's guest is an investigative journalist and author, Jeff Kisseloff. Jeff will be discussing his recently published book titled Rewriting Hisstory. In it, Jeff uncovers the innocence of alleged communist spy Alger Hiss, and he points his finger at who was really behind one of the most sensational and divisive accusations of the 20th century. Keep in mind, this isn't a scholarly armchair effort on Jeff's part. He actually worked for Alger Hiss as a college student in the mid-1970s, and he was so inspired through this association that he continued his research to clear Hiss's name for over 50 years. While the unfounded accusation and unjust imprisonment of Alger Hiss is the subject of our discussion today, it is important to note how the predator class marginalizes its targets through slander and libel, using baseless and inflammatory, divisive labels. These labels range from communist and Black radical on the left to white supremacist and insurrectionist on the right, with everyone that supports human rights, personal and national sovereignty branded a terrorist or a terrorist organization. Yes, the terrorist label casts the widest net. It's why provocateurs hot on violence and law breaking are embedded by the FBI and CIA in every movement that supports policies that benefit the impoverished and working class, and conversely threatens the predator class's control over us. It's why false flags and let it happen events like the Oklahoma City bombing and 9/11 occur. It's why every shoot 'em up movie starts with an opening 1-minute event that justifies the protagonist killing everyone else for 1 hour and 59 minutes. The sick part is that we are conditioned to root for murder if we are first told there is an underlying justification. Folks, this is called programming for a reason. So let's not be complacent just because our organization and group members aren't targeted in a particular defamation campaign. And let's not ignore truth just because its spokesperson isn't from our tribe. Instead, let's heed the words spoken by Malcolm X. I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it is for or against. I'm a human being, first and foremost, and as such, I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole. Also, let's remember our common U.S. patriotic motto, united we stand, divided we fall. Please, Jeff, tell us about yourself and how working for Alger Hiss inspired you to devote your life to clearing his name. Also, why is what happened to Hiss a cautionary tale for us all? Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. I started working for Hiss, in effect, when I was 8 or 9 years old. And my parents used to have these record albums piled against an old console radio. And one of them was a record by Edward R. Murrow called I Can Hear It Now. And it was a recording on that record of Alger Hiss responding to Whittaker Chambers' charges before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And I remember him saying, one of these two men is the greatest liar in the history of all congressional investigations. And not only was fascinated by that, but there was something in Hiss's voice that even as a kid that got to me, where he just didn't seem to understand what was going on or who this person was who was making these accusations and why. And I immediately went to the Golden Book Encyclopedia, which is what we had in our house, and read something about him. And then all through my teenage years, if something would be on the news about Hiss, or I'd pick it up and read it. And eventually I went to work for him because I got bored in college and convinced a professor, let me study the case for credit. and try to decide whether he was innocent or guilty. And I said I would read everything about the case, which I did, that was out there. And it just, I felt I had to do something about it. You know, it's college hubris. I don't know what it was, but here was a man who I felt was railroaded. And it wasn't a matter of even politics then. It was really a matter of this guy was framed somehow. I had to figure out why. And I said, all right, well, I'm going to be the one who's going to figure it out. I mean, it's just hubris. Wow. You know, college junior. And I got his address. I wrote him a note and said, can I help you? I know everything about the case. And eventually I got hired, even when I was in college, to do the research with a couple of other people through the FBI documents that he was just getting from the Freedom of Information Act. And, you know, it occurred to me at some point that he was in such bad straits that he used me like an untested, you know, inexperienced college kid to basically be his head of research. And he used to have Harvard lawyers and their assistants doing his work. And now he had me, which was really just said how difficult things really were for him. And, you know, I just couldn't let go. Once I met Alger, and he would come in there and he would sit next to us and chat with us all day, and we'd read through the documents. And let me just say one more thing, which was friends and relatives used to say, but don't you think he's lying? I mean, everybody said he was lying, and the guy went to jail for this. And I said, well, if he doesn't answer a question to my satisfaction, if I ever find anything in the documents, if I ever come across something and I ask him, he avoids answering the question, I'm out of there. I mean, I didn't have a reputation then, but I had an idea of what I'd be doing in my life, and I wasn't going to screw it up then. I was interested in the truth. I wasn't interested in defending him if he wasn't telling the truth. But I was interested in finding out if he was lying, if he had been a spy, why he was a spy. I mean, I think that's an interesting discussion, is why do we let the Republicans control the issue here about, well, he is or he isn't or whatever. The real question to me is, if you're really going to talk about these people that may have spied for the Soviet Union, was why did they become involved? And I was always fascinated by that. But as it turned out, that Alger just wasn't one of those people who did. And I was going to make sure that people understood that once I knew the truth. And I wasn't going to let go. I hate injustice. I mean, that's why I became a reporter. I was going to make everything right for everybody. And I certainly was for him. He wasn't unhappy, but ever since I was a kid, I just couldn't tolerate injustice. And this was something I was not going to let go of.
Let's get into the evidence of what you found. But first, can you, and some of our listeners may, be young. They don't know much about Alger Hiss. So can you just say who Hiss was and why his case was such a bombshell, and what some of the political ripple effects of his case were? And then we'll get into the evidence.
You might have to keep cueing me about some of that stuff because it's a big case. But Alger was a longtime member of the New Deal. He joined the New Deal in 1933. And he worked his way up and he became a member of the State Department, and a visible one in 1945 when he was the first Secretary General of the United Nations, of the Founding Conference. And back in 1939, a fellow named Whittaker Chambers, who he had known under a different name, went to Adolph A. Burley, the Assistant Secretary of State, and said he knew that there were a bunch of people in the New Deal who were communists or members of the party, and he listed a whole bunch of names. And one of the last people he mentioned was Alger Hiss. And a few times over the next few years, the FBI would come and talk to him, and he would mention names, and Hiss's name would come up. And nothing much happened to it until 1948, when suddenly HUAC brought Chambers in front of their hearings that summer. And very publicly, this is the first time that Chambers was making these charges, he said that Alger Hiss was one of 7 people who were a member of an underground group that he called the Ware Group. And they were secret communists in New Deal, and he said that they weren't spies, though. They just were there to talk, meet, and occasionally discuss policy, whatever. And Hiss objected to this and asked for his time before the committee. The committee granted it 2 days later, and he denied all the charges. And one of the people who seemed determined to pursue this against Hiss was a first-term congressman named Richard Nixon. Now, what Hiss didn't know is that Nixon had been talking to Chambers and other people who knew Chambers all along. And Hiss actually did know Whittaker Chambers, but under a different name, by the name of George Crosley. But Hiss never denied knowing Chambers. He said, I didn't know anybody by the name of Chambers, which is true. Anyway, to make it a little bit shorter, Hiss said to Chambers after they had a confrontation before the TV cameras, the first hearing ever aired on television. On August, he said, you repeat those charges outside the committee and I will sue you for libel. And Chambers did. Hiss sued him. And they were pretrial depositions. And Hiss's attorney kept saying to Chambers, do you have any proof that Hiss was a communist? And Chambers kind of fumbled that. And then one day, November 17th, 48, Chambers shows up for a deposition with an envelope full of documents. And so now he's saying that Hiss was not just a communist, but that he was a spy, and that these documents were typed by Hiss and his wife from State Department documents that he eventually gave to Chambers. He had to amend that because Hiss couldn't type. He also had 4 little scraps of paper that he said that Hiss had written summaries of documents for him. And these became known as the Baltimore documents, and Hiss insisted that they go to the Justice Department and to see how Chambers got hold of these things and typed them. And a couple of weeks later, HUAC, where Nixon was, got wind that Chambers had turned up something. And so they asked Chambers if he had any more. And he said, why don't you come over to the farm tonight? But they gave him a subpoena. And he walks out into his pumpkin patch, opens up a hollowed out pumpkin, and pulls out several rolls and strips of film that he said were documents that Hiss gave him. And these became known as the pumpkin papers. And actually, none of those documents came from Hiss. They were a bunch of garbage and various other papers that people had that Chambers was able to get hold of. Anyway, there was a grand jury that they got Hiss in front of and Chambers in front of, and they asked Hiss on the last day of the grand jury, did you do this? Did you see Chambers after a certain date, which was the date of the documents? And Hiss said no. And since they couldn't get him on espionage because the statute of limitations had run out, they charged him with perjury for denying that he had committed espionage. The first trial occurred about 6 months later. He was a hung jury, which is amazing in a way. And then the second trial, he was convicted. He always said that he had been framed. And he said that up until the end of his life. And he went to jail for 44 months and came out, basically became a stationery salesman and did that until he retired. Now, you asked about the significance of the case, which was really quite a lot. The people who really were after Hiss were people who wanted to destroy the New Deal, the programs of the New Deal, and the liberalism of the New Deal. If we remember, Roosevelt had a different way of looking at government. He kind of felt that the United States government had a responsibility for the welfare of the people. And this was something that people hated. People thought that the government was really about business. And they hated the liberal programs of the New Deal. And they wanted to destroy Roosevelt. Roosevelt engendered more hate than anybody that you can possibly imagine. And one of the people that they went after among 1,400 or so in 1941 was Alger. HUAC in 41 compiled a list of 1,400 New Dealers that they said were communist. This was their great effort to destroy the New Deal. And they handed the list to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General basically laughed at it and said it's ridiculous. I think there was one person that they transferred. But the people who put that list together didn't give up. And they just kept going after Alger for years and years and years and years until they finally succeeded. And really, the trial separated the left. It divided the left in all kinds of ways and took the steam out of the left. The old Roosevelt coalition was pretty much gone after that. You had Truman and his loyalty boards. Truman was as bad as you can imagine on the communist issue. And I think the Democrats never recovered. I think for years after that, the Democrats had to fight this battle of being soft on communism. And so you had a case eventually like LBJ, who basically says, I'm stuck in Vietnam because I don't want to be seen as weak on communism. And I think that goes back to the Hiss case. And then even more so, I think Eisenhower probably would have won the election anyway in 1952. But the Hiss case freed him and his State Department head, John Foster Dulles, to interfere with all kinds of things and just basically run amok through around the world. I have to tell you that I had to do a lot of research into the Dulles brothers and talk about a black hole. The things that they were up to were just astonishing. And, John Dulles was on the board of IG Farben during the war. They were the people that made Zyklon B. I mean, and I believe that they were involved ultimately in the frame-up of Hiss. And when you look at all the things that the Dulles brothers were involved in, building a typewriter or having somebody build a typewriter was really nothing. So there are all these connections there, which I think are pretty solid.
I read something about a connection to Standard Oil and a congressperson that was involved with Hiss, that they were bringing some charges against Standard Oil. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's interesting. I'm not sure it went quite that way. What I recall is that Allen Dulles was representing Standard Oil, and basically FDR thought that they were traitors because they were charging all these astonishing prices for the American soldiers who needed oil and gas and all of that to conduct the war. And Roosevelt insisted that they lower the price, and Allen Dulles said, not going to happen. And he actually hired Arthur Goldberg to investigate the Dulleses. And he thought, and I think he even wiretapped them. And the story that I read was that Henry Wallace, either on purpose or accidentally, tipped off the Dulleses that they were being wiretapped. And that was the reason why FDR dropped Wallace from the ticket and had Truman on instead. Well, that was the connection. Alger he went after Bernard Baruch, who made enormous profits during World War I. And I don't think that Baruch had anything to do with it, but there were a group of South Carolinians who all had something against Hiss going back to 1933. And I think they just sort of figured into the story all this hostility to Hiss, which made it easy for them to go after him.
So you would say that Hiss was more of a good government person, someone who believed that the government should serve the people and not an elite group of oil barons, so to speak.
Absolutely. I think he was very much a Roosevelt liberal. People who say that he was a communist can never point to anything that indicated that he was a member of the party. Now, when I was a kid, I had a little more sympathy for Whittaker Chambers because I thought the response to the Depression was not really a liberal response, but should have been a more radical response. So if I had a disagreement with Alger, it was because he was a little conservative for me, and he was known as a kind of a conservative voice in the State Department. It's just the idea that he was a communist was. I don't say there's anything wrong with it. I just don't think he was one.
My background in political economy as an undergraduate student, with some very radical professors, they always cited Roosevelt as saving capitalism. And it wasn't a positive thing. because they believed that if it wasn't for Roosevelt saving capitalism, there might have been a socialist or communist takeover. So it's quite curious that the New Dealers were infiltrated and considered communists when actually the communists at the time weren't in support of the New Deal. They wanted a radical restructuring of the United States.
I think there were people who joined the party for all different reasons, I think. And the party was very popular in those days. And John Abt, who was a member of the party, and Nat Witt and Pressman were key members in Washington. They believed that the New Deal programs should be supported. Harold Ware, who was in the agricultural department, they saw the New Deal as the way that the suffering would end. Now, did they agree with everything that Roosevelt did? No, he didn't. But Roosevelt saw the way to end the suffering was by guaranteeing profits for the capitalists. And that was the old line that, he saved the country by saving these companies. But as being a communist, his line was that he used to open the cabinet meetings by saying, "Hello, socialists." And Norman Thomas basically accused him of stealing all the party's programs, including Social Security. And, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, this was a radical idea that they were going to pay farmers not to grow food. That was going to end the shortage. This was a very radical idea. But even more so than that was that Alger had drawn up a contract which said that when they pay the sharecroppers, they would get the money directly. They weren't going to pay the farm owners who would then be trusted to pay the sharecroppers. And there's a Cotton Ed Smith who went in to see Alger, and he was from South Carolina, and he was furious. You're not going to let me pay and I'm not going to use the word here, but you can imagine the word that he used. And all these people hated Alger for socialism. He was accused of being a socialist by a woman named Leonora Fuller. He wasn't, but, these ideas were considered, way too radical for them to accept, even though really it was, as you point out, about saving capitalism.
Well, one of the things that's very curious, and we talk about often on our show, is the American public doesn't really have a good understanding of economic systems. And for example, they'll consider Biden a socialist, and we clearly consider Biden a corporatist. And so these terms, socialist, communist, capitalist, seem to go over a lot of people's heads. So one thing I like to say is we have a socialist country. It's just inverted. We bail out banks. We bail out high-end executives because they're too big to fail. But we expect, working people to adhere to the most stringent forms of capitalism, and in reverse. So yes, we have socialism. It's just not for the impoverished and the working class. It's only for the elite and the class such as that. So I just want to clarify that point. Thank you.
When they use the term socialist or communist, they're just using it to get votes. They're not. Nobody's really thought of what Alger stood for or what he was about or why he was there. It was just a way of labeling them so they can get rid of liberals, really, by calling them communists.
And Jeff, maybe can you summarize some of the key evidence? Because there in certain circles they still say, and I think in a lot of the college courses they may still present it that Hiss was a communist spy, and that there are these Venona documents that implicate him. My sense is that's the way it's taught still in a lot of college courses. I don't know if you would agree with that. But what is some of the, how would you summarize the key evidence? You researched this vigorously for 50 years. Obviously you did other things in some of that period, but so what is the key evidence that exonerates Hiss in your mind?
That exonerates him, or they used to go after him?
Well, maybe address both parts of my question.
Right, sure. It's actually the same thing. The key evidence that the government put out was that these documents that Chambers handed over were typed on the same typewriter as letters they were able to obtain from the Hisses the Hisses had sent out. They looked at the typing on the letters from the typewriter that the Hisses owned in the 1930s, and they looked at the typing on the documents, and they said it's exactly the same. So therefore, Hiss had to have typed the Baltimore documents. And that really was, the government's case really centered around that. Whittaker Chambers, his testimony about them being in a party together, I'm not sure that Whittaker Chambers was such a great witness. In fact, in the first trial, the government said, if you don't believe Chambers, we don't have a case. And I guess the jury didn't believe him because it was a hung jury. But in the second trial, they really relied on the documents. And they said that these documents were key to Hiss being the spy. Now, on the opposite end, what Hiss was able to find out in many different ways, there are a lot of different ways that I looked into this. Well, first of all, they claimed that the typewriter that the family owned, they gave away in 1937. And the documents that Chambers turned over were all dated in 1938. So therefore, they said, we couldn't have typed those documents. And also, the documents themselves were really fascinating. For instance, Chambers said that, I'll just take any document A or document B, that this was of great interest to the Russians. But the documents were kind of silly, but sometimes whoever typed or summarized the documents actually left out the information that really would have been of interest to the Russians. It wasn't included. So that convinced me that there was a real problem here. And that, then there was the question of Hiss being a communist. He just wasn't. There just really was no evidence that he was. And a lot of what I did was, what they called shoe leather reporting. So supposedly Priscilla Hiss typed these documents every night. Alger would bring them home and she would type up the documents, and then Chambers would come pick them up and bring them to a photographer. They would be photographed and they would be returned that night, and Alger would bring them back the next morning. That was the story. So I looked into every aspect of this story that I could. First of all, he lived in a house. There were 3 houses connected to each other. The walls must have been made of cardboard. They were built during the Civil War days. The neighbors on the north side and the neighbors on the south side said, we never heard any typing. Not a word. The only thing we heard was Alger's stepson playing the piano at night, and it was just, we had to deal with it. And then they said that when Hiss moved out, one of the neighbors to the north said a sports writer moved in and was typing on deadline. It drove us crazy. And then one of the things that I did, Tony Hiss, actually Alger's son, lent me the typewriter, the Woodstock typewriter, and I had it in my house for a year. So the first thing I did was take a tape recorder, put it 2 rooms away from where my office was, and start typing on the machine while the recorder went on. And then I went and got the recorder. You could hear it clear as a bell. And then Alger always said that this typewriter, 230099, was planted on them. It wasn't their machine. This was the evidence that he was innocent. And I got a hold of 2 professional microscopes, and I looked at the machine and at the type bars, and you could see solder dripping from the type bars. Somebody had altered these things. Now, the government claimed when Hiss said that this was a fake machine, and you can tell by the type bars, the government's response was all Woodstocks had those dripping solder from the type bars. So I got on eBay and I bought 20 Woodstock typewriters and put them in my garage, and then had somebody photograph the same type bars. And then using, Adobe program, I could put up on the screen 20 different type bars for the letter A or B or G. And then you could see it all dripping from 23099, but straight across on all the other machines. So the government was lying in that case. And, you know, there were all kinds of strange things about the machine. You know, people said that it was kept outside for a matter of weeks or months at a time, that they couldn't type. Priscilla Hiss gave it away because it couldn't type. This machine could type perfectly fine. And I then took one of my Woodstocks, put it out in the rain in Portland, Oregon. In 2 days, the thing was completely useless. So how could this typewriter be so perfect and it was the defense that put it into evidence. And I said, Alger, look at this typewriter. It's in perfect condition. Didn't that raise your suspicion? And he said, well, if we had gotten the typewriter and not put it into evidence, then they would have come after us for hiding the machine. So while we had some suspicions about it, we had no choice but to put it into evidence. And they did. And I spent a lot of time looking at it, and it was clear that this thing had been altered and that somebody had basically used it to type the documents. And it took years for me to figure out who that was, but eventually I did.
Yeah, and let's get into that with the culprits you name and the intelligence connection with Otto Schmall. Although first, can you briefly go over the Venona document controversy and how that's used to make like he's guilty when in fact that evidence is problematic, to say the least?
So the National Security Agency released what it claimed were telegrams that they had decrypted between the Soviet Union and its agents in North America. And one of these telexes mentioned an agent named Ailes. And it was their position that this person, Ailes, based on the description of what he did and who he was in the telex, was Alger Hiss. So in 1977, 18 years before that, I was the first civilian to see the Venona. They were in one of the FOIA releases that we got. And I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. It was just such a strange thing. It was some kind of cable that said Alger got, one of the things it said was that he was given an award from the Soviet Union for what he did. And Alger was standing, I remember he was standing by the wall at boxes of documents. And I remember looking over at him. I couldn't figure out what this was about. And I said, did you get an award from the Soviet Union ever? And he looked at me like I was out of my mind. Now, I really wish I remember what he said, but I could still picture his face. And so then 18 years later, we get a hold of these documents, and we see what Venona really was about, but I've got to backtrack a little bit. I'm sorry. The reason why Venona appeared in the FOIA files was because J. Edgar Hoover simply didn't believe it. He thought it was a crock. And so he spent 2.5 years investigating whether Alger Hiss was indeed Ailes. And eventually, what turned the case for him was Kathleen Harrington and George Kennan. Now, one of the things in Venona says that Ailes was at Yalta, the post-war conference where policies were decided between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain. And another person named George Kennan, the economist, were both at Yalta with Alger. And one of the things that Venona says was that Ailes received either an award or a thank you from the Soviet Union. And George Kennan, who was no friend of Alger's, said, no, it wasn't going to happen. It couldn't have happened. Don't believe it for a second. And it was that convinced J. Edgar Hoover that there was nothing to this. That Ailes, even though one of the agents said, well, Ailes is probably Alger Hiss, he just didn't believe it. Now, it's interesting that he only said that Ailes was Alger Hiss because this had been a couple of months after conviction. And they said, well, it kind of sounds like Hiss. And when the NSA released the telexes, they used this as strong evidence. Well, the FBI said that Ailes was probably Alger Hiss, when in fact, J. Edgar Hoover, he just didn't believe it. But of course, when the telexes came out, everybody said, well, it says that his family members work for him in the telex, and that could be Priscilla Hiss and Donald Hiss, even though the FBI said that Priscilla did not work for him, nor did his brother work for him. It said that he worked for military intelligence going back to 1935. Whittaker Chambers actually said that it work didn't start till 1937. And there were, just all these things which simply didn't make sense. I like to say that Ailes could be Alger Hiss if you did a form of the Rosemary Woods stretch, which was just to take all this evidence and try to make it fit Alger Hiss. When in fact, if you read the telexes, it just doesn't fit. I've had people say, well, Venona says that Hiss was guilty. But then I say, well, did you read it? Did you look at the telex? Do you look at the facts compared to that? Well, kind of not really. Alan Weinstein, who was a professor who said that Hiss was guilty, wrote a book called The Haunted Wood, in which he said that evidence from the Soviet files supported it. But, I have a hard time believing a lot of what those Soviet files say, because the facts often don't match what the files say either. I mean, this is a whole other issue, which involved a lot of reporting, where if the file said one thing, I went to look at what the truth was that the FBI heard, or what they were saying privately. And again, too many times the information didn't match. I think that the information was recorded accurately by the person who was given access to the Soviet files, but what the files said, I don't buy it.
So not only was this done to kind of splinter the left and to derail the New Deal, but it was also used as a point to jump off from for Richard Nixon, right? Did you
oh boy,
want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Richard Nixon was a freshman congressman who needed an issue to move his career around, and somebody told him about the charges against Hiss. And as a congressman, he just ran with it. Other members of HUAC were a little bit doubtful about the charges, and were a little bit doubtful about having Whittaker Chambers be their person, their point person. But Nixon went with it, in part because he was being fed information by one of the investigators for HUAC, a guy named Ben Mandel, who knew Whittaker Chambers back in the 1920s when they both worked for the Daily Worker. And Mandel was somebody who went from left to right, along with a partner of his named Isaac Don Levine. And the two of them decided that they were going to basically destroy liberalism. That's what it was really about. And they did whatever they can to try to nail Hiss. And they, it was, what can we do? They even produced phony documents back in the early 40s to get him on a Hatch Act charge. But they, it kept failing when the State Department said, we know Alger Hiss, and there's nothing left about him at all. But they kept going with it, and eventually the information was fed to Nixon. And Nixon was the person who led the committee's investigation. And of course was, being fed this information that was damaging to Hiss all along publicly. You see, the key to this was in the court of public opinion, so to speak. They had this situation where at first they thought that Hiss was saying, I never met Chambers, and Chambers was saying he was my best friend. And that really wasn't the case, but that's the way they portrayed it. And so when Hiss eventually said, yes, I do know Chambers, I do know his name was George Crosley, but I knew him as Whittaker Chambers, it was very damaging to Hiss. But here was the thing. Whittaker Chambers said that Alger Hiss was his best friend in the communist underground. And Alger Hiss's house on 30th Street in Georgetown was his headquarters. He was there all the time. None of the neighbors ever saw him or heard him at all. And so on August 7th, 2 days after he first testified, Whittaker Chambers is called again before the committee and asked for details about Hiss's life. he spends hours rolling out all these details about his schooling and what he and his wife call each other and everything, all these personal details. And the committee said it was amazing how accurate he was in all of these details. He knew everything about Hiss. So therefore, he must be telling the truth. When the fact is, he knew nothing about Hiss. Most of the details were wrong. 90% of them he got wrong. He thought Hiss was 5'10", Hiss was over 6 feet. He said Hiss was deaf. He wasn't deaf. And one of the really interesting, telling things about this whole case was in 1938 or 37, Alger's stepson, Tim Hobson, was in a terrible bicycle accident, and he almost lost his leg. And he was laid up for several months in this house. And Whitaker, a family, was just, they had to care for him all the time. They had to do all this, it just, their whole lives were wrapped around saving Tim's leg. Whitaker Chambers had no idea. He didn't know until he was tipped off 4 months later that Tim Hobson was in an accident. He just had no idea whatsoever. So this story that he was there every day, that he knew the family, was just a lot of crap. And there was the perfect example. And then to finish this off, Tim Hobson was born in 26. So at the time of the trial, he was 22 years old. And he said, I want to testify that what Chambers said was a lie. And Tim had been in the Navy during the war and been thrown out because he was gay. And the FBI came to him and said, we know your sexual history, and we are going to spread this all over the place if you testify. And so Tim said, I don't care. I still want to testify. And Alger said, I'd rather go to jail than have your career destroyed. And, he did. But his whole life, I saw Tim several times, spent a few days with him, always said that the story that Chambers was coming around. He was right there all the time. He said it was untrue. He took it's not a truth serum, but it was, they gave him, sodium amytal or something like that to see if he was telling the truth. And
Pentotal?
Yeah. And then ultimately, I said to him, but Tim, you're Alger's stepson. Why would anybody believe you? And I always thought his answer was pretty amazing. He said, I didn't love them enough to lie for them. That was really a really perfect response.
What was driving Chambers? What did he get out of it?
Well, first of all, Chambers was subpoenaed to testify before HUAC. I'm not sure how thrilled he was about it. Ultimately, he thought of himself by then. He was really terribly psychologically abused as a child. He had no friends in high school. He was known as Stinky in high school. He was thrown out of Columbia at one point. He was a closeted bisexual. He confessed to the FBI at one point that this was really his life. And I think at that point, the FBI had him. They could get him to say what he wanted. And I think, though, by 1948, he saw himself as somebody who could save the world. He was going to be the man between world communism takeover and the free world. And he saw himself, he really did think of himself in that way. He also saw himself as writing a best-selling book. And he was also negotiating his exit from Time magazine at that time so he could write a book. And so, all these things sort of, came to a head. I have sympathy for him. Alger thought he was mentally ill, and he couldn't be angry. I used to say, don't you hate Chambers? And he'd say, how can I feel, for somebody who was mentally ill? I just don't. Chambers was also a thief. Chambers claimed that when he left the Communist Party that they came after him because he was such a valuable spy. But actually, he'd stolen $2,000 from them, and consider that in today's money, and they wanted their money back. His wife was also a thief. She stole the name of somebody to use for credit. And 3 days after Alger was indicted, she actually killed a woman. She ran over her in an intersection, and And somehow that charge became reduced to a traffic charge. I always wondered about that. You cannot get hold of the transcript of that case. And she was found not guilty. And, you know, I was very suspicious of that and spent a lot of time trying to figure out why those charges were reduced and who was protecting her. She spent all of 3 minutes in jail for speeding through an intersection and killing an elderly African-American woman who had stepped off the curb and not seen her. Now, of course, this was Baltimore, so a white person, you know, killing an African-American person, you know, nobody was going to really charge her anyway for that. But I think that the FBI stepped in and made sure that that charge was reduced. And then after that, she, you know, she was all in, even though she was like the worst witness in the world, you know. She said that she went to Alger's house and was a guest there, and that the living room was pink and the bookshelves were on this side and the bathroom was on this side. And she perfectly described the house next door, which had an opposite layout, because somebody had given her the layouts of the houses there so that she could memorize them. She did a pretty bad job of it.
One of the things that Jayme and I talk about a lot is how the mentally ill, the physically ill, the impoverished, or the incarcerated are weaponized by the intelligence agencies and used as tools to achieve various objectives. And within this context, it seems that this may be the case. What do you think about that here?
Absolutely. I mean, Whittaker Chambers, well, look, he didn't want anybody to know his sexual history. He wrote it out in hand. It was a 16-page document that the FBI didn't release until 10 years ago. The first time we got it in the 70s, they cut out 12 of the pages. And so once the FBI had this on Chambers, they basically could get what they want out of him. And they spent months working with him, working on his testimony. And he was perfectly willing to do it. He was also extremely paranoid. If you had lunch with Whittaker Chambers, he had to sit in the back of the room with his back to the wall. Supposedly, he kept a gun in his desk at Time magazine because, you know, they were after him. And in fact, the only people I could see that were after him was, as I said, the people who gave him the money, that wanted their money back. We've never seen a document that Whittaker Chambers actually handed over to the Russians. That's never shown up anyplace. I think that they just took advantage of this guy who was also, you know, had visions of grandeur. And because he had been so abused. So for them, once they were able to pound the story into him, he was the perfect guy for them. He was a perfect tool to get what they wanted. And, you know, it's interesting to me, there are two parts to this. There was the trial of Alger Hiss, and then there was the framing of Alger Hiss. And there were two different reasons for this. The trial, that was fixed by the FBI because Hoover had to have a conviction. And so what they did was they messed with the defense witnesses. They got people to lie on the stand. They worked with the Chambers to get their testimony. They needed to get a conviction, and they got a conviction. It wasn't a fair trial by any matter. It just wasn't a fair trial. A key witness was a maid who said that she was able to identify Alger and Priscilla as visitors to their house. But if you read the statement to the FBI, it's not what she said. I mean, this happened a lot. But then there was the framing of Alger Hiss, which began really in 1939 and continued through the 40s as part of an effort to destroy liberalism. And these were these two guys named Ben Mandel and Isaac Don Levine, who didn't give up. Ben Mandel was a former communist who was so determined to destroy anybody on the left that he would call up Isaac Don Levine, like on a Saturday morning at 7 o'clock, and say, let's go after this guy. Let's do this to get this guy. And let's do that. Isaac Don Levine, who hated communists more, they had to tell him, stop it. I can't, wait till 10 o'clock before you call and tell me all these schemes. Ben Mandel had one scheme after another. And one of the things that he did was used phony paper to go after Alger and Priscilla back in the early 40s. It was kind of a test run. In the 40s, they tried to get him on a Hatch Act violation, which said that federal government employees could not work for politics, could not be involved in politics. So they tried that and it didn't work. But eventually they used paper, in other words, the Baltimore documents, to frame him. And, I had a friend named Bill Rubin, who was a reporter, an investigative reporter, who was really the first person to suggest the Rosenbergs were innocent. And Bill investigated the Hiss case for 50 years. And when he was 90 years old, I still remember him sitting in a chair opposite me, and he was a bellower, he was a yeller. And he said, "Before I die, I want to get one thing on the record," he said. "The only two people with any secretarial typing experience in this case are Esther Chambers and Pat Nixon." It was his theory that, they were the ones who typed these things. And, for all I know, could have been true.
With the brief time we have, can you say something about Otto Schmall and his connection with Wild Bill Donovan and how this may point to a larger intelligence operation?
Well, Schmall was he was an investigator that was hired by the Hisses. And it turned out that Schmall, Horace is his first name,
Horace,
had been a counterintelligence officer. And that's a really interesting connection. We knew Schmall as basically the mole that the FBI used in the defense. So when the defense was gathering information, Schmall was handing it over to the FBI. Now, there's some thinking that Schmall, as a counterintelligence agent, could have arranged or built the typewriter. Well, I don't happen to think that's true. I think that involves too many people. But I do think that he was involved in the plot to frame Hiss by making sure that a rebuilt typewriter was placed in the hands of somebody that the defense would find. And Schmall eventually became involved in the Galindez case. He was and Galindez was in the Dominican Republic. He was a dissident against Trujillo, and he was tossed out of an airplane in 1956. And there was some question about whether Schmall was involved in this or not. But Isaac Don Levine was well known to have CIA connections. Ben Mandel was an FBI informant. So there were a lot of connections, and of course to the Dulleses, who had connections to forgers, from Germany. So there's an awful lot of connection to the SB, to the spy agencies. My first thing was to find out, was Hiss guilty? That was easily that he was not guilty. Then the next question was, who did it? And by process of elimination, it came down easily to Mandel and Levine. But I do think that the other agencies certainly had a hand in this because of their connections. But they kept it as close as possible because they didn't want a wide net to know about this, because eventually it would have been found out. So they kept it in-house, so to speak.
And why do you they still want to keep the myth alive today of Hiss's guilt. And that may in part, do you think, relate also to the new Cold War with Russia? They want to keep this kind of Cold War climate alive. So they have to make us believe that Hiss was a spy and that this was a real phenomenon, in those days, and it's happening again today, would you say?
Yeah, because you look under, every liberal is a spy, basically. And everybody who represents this form of government has to be a spy.
Or who wants peace with Russia, because Hiss was in the Yalta, that was a cooperative agreement with the Russians to prevent really a Cold War or a hot war. So they had to smear him and others. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how they got, that's how they basically won the 1952 election, was by smearing Hiss and smearing Roosevelt. But of course they had, Eisenhower, who was a pretty popular candidate, but Stevenson, who was worked with Hiss back in the 30s, really had no chance because of the association with him. And really it was just about destroying any kind of the end of liberal policies in the United States. And it worked. Look what Eisenhower was able to do in Guatemala. Look what he was able to do, in Iran. They were able to get what they want. And, we don't have the time, but there was a group called the Polecats, who were William Loeb, the China Lobby. They were about destroying civil liberties in this country, going to war with Russia, putting union people in jail. And that's why these people eventually got behind this effort to destroy Hiss, because they wanted a Dewey victory, and they had the connections to Dewey where they felt that Dewey was going to do this. And the hearings before HUAC in 1948 were all a part of this. This was how they were going to win the 48 election, by getting Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley to testify that basically the Democrats were soft on communism. And so if they could do that, Dewey could win, and then they could end civil liberties in this country. And it really just shows how a small group of people can possibly have a huge impact on the policies of this country. Can you imagine if Dewey had won? And really the other thing that this tells us, this case, is about how the power of government can be brought down on one person in order to make an example of that person, to really change everything that we know, and to bring about, you know, I hate to say it, but fascism in this country. And that was the intent in 1948. They were going to change everything, and they almost succeeded. And they're doing pretty well now, I think.
Jeff, I think we're coming up to the end of the hour. And could you please tell our audience where they can find your important work, and where they could get your book?
Amazon is probably the best source, or the publisher is the University Press of Kansas. Anybody can write to them. There's also a website for the book called rewritinghistory.com, where, because I know I'm going to be accused of being a liar, I am posting every document that I use in the book, so that people can judge for themselves whether I'm telling the truth.
And Rewriting History is a
Yes.
play on words. It's because this is involving Hiss, Alger
Correct.
Hiss.
That's great. Very clever of me.
Yes, it's nice. Okay, and I believe that wraps up our show for today. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate the work you've done, and you giving us this interview. Thank you. And that wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to share and like our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. That was great.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Was it okay? I mean, seriously, was it okay?
Terrific.
Yeah, we're still on the air, but we're not on the radio.
Yeah, that was really great, guys. I think
Thank you. Really appreciate it. I've never been able to have such just sharp questions and the time to talk before like this. Is really appreciated. Thank you.
What is that? That went off smart
That
too.
was, I'm sorry. I tried to turn off my messaging. Somebody just,
Okay.
brilliant. That was great.
That was great, Jeff. Yeah, you really done great work. So,
Yeah, you got two of the sharpest people here asking you questions too.
Well, one thing I really wanted to say, but I didn't really get a chance, is Jeremy and I spent a lot of time talking about MK Ultra. It's like one of our favorite topics. And our research into MK Ultra is really into two things. One is hypnosis, and the other is into the whole concept of fragmenting personalities to create dissociative disorders. And in all of my research on dissociative disorders, it deals a lot with two different things. You can create this through torture. You could create it through isolation, sleep deprivation, and also sexual abuse. And you can really create dissociative disorders and create these kind of Manchurian candidates, or these kind of bots that do your bidding, especially if this is done to children. And this is really tragic and horrific. But if you have abused children, they're already prone to these dissociative disorders because they have to dissociate the pain from the person inflicting it, if it's a family member or a close friend of the family. So that positions them very well for these MK Ultra programs. And there is a lot of overlap between them seeking these children, these abused children. So it's not unusual for me to hear that someone such as Chambers had an abusive childhood. It fits the pattern.
And you know, the sad thing is, if he had been allowed to live the life he wanted to live, right, as a gay man in Greenwich Village, you know, we wouldn't have had the Hiss case. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced of that. It was, you know, that part of American life where he had to live in the closet. He was so afraid that he would be found out. You know, this was something that they hid for years, and his friends concealed it from, you know, it was just, and by the way, Esther was also gay. And there were 4 people that lived in a house on East 11th Street, and everybody assumed that they were all coupling with each other. But I just found it sad. I mean, I ultimately found Chambers sad. I never was angry with Whittaker Chambers. You can get angry with Hoover and you can get angry with Nixon, although Alger wasn't angry with Nixon. But I just found Chambers to be, you know, he was abused, as you said, and he was taken advantage of.
And the irony is that they make him on the conservative side into this great moral beacon, and there are these books that come out, you know, praising him as this moral icon or something.
Witness is, well, they love Witness, right? Because that's been, and Witness is just a lot of crap. I mean, as a memoir, I mean, there's a story in the book, which maybe you've read, which Robert Crichton got a hold of Witness in his early drafts, and he thought it was the craziest stuff he ever read in his life, and it was really scary to him. And, you know, I'll just give you an example. He writes in Witness about how he was recruited into the underground by a guy named Max Bedacht. And he goes over to Max Bedach's house to get his orders. And Max Bedacht has 8 kids, and they're running around the house creating all kinds of havoc, and he has to get out of there. Well, Max Bedacht had 2 kids who by then were in their 20s and were not living in the house. Whittaker Chambers had simply read a piece of doggerel that somebody had written in the Daily Worker that said, Max Bedacht mit der Kinder act. It just rhymed. And it was Max Bedacht with his 8 kids. And Whittaker Chambers used that in Witness to advance this story about how Max Bedacht recruited him. It was all garbage. But people believe that stuff, and, you know, they run with it. I mean, it's one example after another. He said he was recruited into the party because they thought he was related to a guy named Robert Chambers, who had died and who had a lot of money, and that they wanted Chambers' money. This was also a primary reason. Well, Robert Chambers didn't die till 2 years after Chambers said he was recruited into the party. It's just invented crap. And yet it's there, and people believe it because they want to believe it. That's all. You know, he fits the bill of this story about communists, you know, taking over the world and making it a religion. It's just, you know, he was a talented writer and a fantasist, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we don't even know what he did and what was done for him that he represented as his own, right?
I think it's pretty clear that he was not a member of the underground. For instance, he said that he worked with the Ware group, people I mentioned before. Harold Ware was an agriculture expert who went to the Soviet Union, and that there was this group called the Ware group. It turned out the group was actually called the Cling Peaches because they worked on a case involving Cling Peaches. Chambers had no idea. And which again is just proof that he really wasn't involved in the way that he claimed. I mean, they said that there's some evidence that he was actually a German spy. There are people who believe that he was not a communist, but actually a Nazi spy. And that when Alger met him and everybody else met him, he always spoke with a German accent. He pretended to be a German national. And he wasn't around that much. I never saw him. And so he just invented this persona. In his case, he pretended to be German. Why? I don't know. And then, you know, he translated all these German books, and he's famous for translating Bambi into English. That was Whittaker Chambers' great claim to fame as a translator, except that the publisher said he did such a shitty job that it had to be retranslated by the publisher himself.
Yeah.
He wasn't the person who he said he was, not even close.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to go, but yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. And hopefully you can post this on your website.
You bet.
Great.
You bet. Thank you. So when will it be up on BAI, or when will it be people be able to link to it?
It should be up on BAI next Friday.
Okay. So any information.
And it's also on Progressive Radio Network. I think that would be the following Tuesday.
Okay. I mean, if you can get to me any information about when people can hear it, you bet I'll post it. And
Sure.
And post to YouTube. You should be able to, if you go on YouTube, even in Google, it should come up. You know, just put Left on Left, Pass to the Go, Jeff Kisseloff, and then you can post the link on your website of this interview. Yeah.
And you're also on Rumble too. Anything else, Jayme, besides
well, we're on several platforms, but YouTube and Rumble are the ones where you'll be able to watch the video after the fact.
Okay,
and
great.
I did send you those links before today's show, so you should have them in your email.
Okay, that's terrific. Listen, I have no idea how good I was, or whether it worked or not, but thank you.
Wonderful. You were wonderful.
It was great. Yeah, it was terrific.
And I don't get this chance to do this very often, and you folks have been wonderful from the start, and thank you very, very much.
I thought it was fascinating. I'd never heard of Alger Hiss before.
Yeah. Well, it's a great story, and I have a hard
really
time.
is.
You know, I didn't say this, but you know, I worked so hard on this. I had 3 mini strokes while I was finishing the book, and 2 heart attacks, and that's how determined I was to finish this thing. And so I don't really like to speak often because words don't come to me, and stories get a little bit jumbled. And
Not one bit. Jeff,
you
rocked it. Not one bit.
Yeah, you sounded great today.
It can be difficult. My wife says that we're still on the air, but it's fine.
It's an incredible book as well. Yeah, the research is really incredible. So,
well, it was. Thank you. I mean, it took. People say, "Why did it take 50 years?" And I just say, "Well, I'm kind of slow." You know. Even the tortoise wins the race every once in a while, and I guess I'm an example of that. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
I think this story. Oh, thank you very much. But I think this story is very relevant today as it was for 70 years ago.
Yeah, and that's the problem. People are out to destroy the book. I mean, within a day of it was published, commentary came out, just saying it was, I was a liar, basically. And even though he said I didn't discuss any of the evidence that he put out in his book Spies, this guy named Harvey Clare. But we had gone through it 10 years ago in 2014. And I just think that there's more evidence that's more important. And I knew that the review would come out, but they really tried to destroy the book and really destroy me as
they continue that method of smearing. That we covered that a lot on this show, and we had that like with Robert Kennedy. Whether you agree or disagree with him, there's no nuance. When they attack him, they use these smears. They don't even engage with anything. Just one example. It's those techniques. And that's another reason I think the Hiss case is so important, because they don't want to engage in the evidence. They use these character smearing and accusations, and it destroys any democratic discourse. It's a cancer on our society.
And it shows how long they've been using this playbook.
Yeah.
Same playbook over and over and over.
Because it works, right? Now, I'll disagree with a lot of what Kennedy says, but you're right.
Yeah.
And actually, there are points that he makes which are quite good about corporations getting involved with, these things and not to be trusted. I think he's right about some of that. But, I really took it down to the level of a reporter. Let me dig into the facts here and let me see if this is true.
Even more than a reporter, you did this like forensic analysis with the typewriters and the recording devices. I mean, I found this all fascinating.
Every angle, everything I could think of, and including typing on I mean, I don't know how she could have typed that much. I think I'd say that this typewriter would have made Arnold Schwarzenegger break down in tears. I mean, you could type on this thing for 5 minutes and your hands are just finished. It just, none of this made any sense whatsoever when you really dug into it. And, that's the way I was taught, that in journalism school, they say on the first day, if your grandmother says she loves you, check it out. And that's been my philosophy as a reporter ever since. So that's
the way it should be.
The other thing we find is when they attach a very inflammatory label to something like communist or white supremacist, people are like, oh, well, I'm not going to pay attention to that because that's not my tribe. That's not my group. So why do I care if someone is falsely accused as a communist because I'm not one? Or why do I care if someone's falsely accused as a white supremacist or a insurrectionist if they're not? Because that's not my tribe. And one of the things that we try to achieve on Left is to get away from this tribalism and to just look at where is truth, where is justice. And it doesn't matter who's saying it. We examine the facts and we look at them. And, we urge all our viewers on every side of the political spectrum to always, look at what's going on and to subject everything to your own analysis and to form your own opinions.
Everybody marginalizes their opponent, right? I mean, they're the others. So by making them the others, they're the people to be distrusted or disbelieved. And, the effort was in the 40s to make basically, Roosevelt and his supporters, others. The attacks on Roosevelt were just, he had syphilis, they were just vicious and nothing compared to today. I mean, it was much worse back then. And he had, most of the press was against him too. It just, everything was about that. He was just others. And in those cases, mostly it was the Jews. That's what they used against them. Frankfurter was Jewish, who brought in Hiss. Roosevelt was secretly Jewish. That was the whole thing. Eleanor Roosevelt slept with Jews. They were evil for that reason. So, it happens all the time. And it worked, as you say, it worked. And it'll continue to work. People are afraid.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing us the truth and a really thorough analysis. Thank you.
Well, I hope it was okay. Thank you very much. So
okay, we'll be in touch.
And really a pleasure. Thanks again. All right, bye-bye.
Have a great day.
All right. So I guess it's time to wrap up the show. Jeremy has to run. Thank you, Jeff. So everybody, that's why you watch the show live, because you get the bonus content. That last 10, 15 minutes is not going to be on the radio show. So you guys got to see something that they won't hear. The people driving the cars won't hear. So thank you for tuning in, and thanks for the comments. I see Anna Ringwald and Katie out there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for commenting. It's been a very interesting show for me, and I find it fascinating. I'd never heard of Alger Hiss before. And all I knew coming into the show was a little bit I had looked at in the materials for the show before we started. So it was really fascinating to hear what this was all about. But it's the same playbook. We're going up against these narrative people who are in charge of the narrative. They do all this narrative control, and now they've just become masters of projection. So I feel like every time they make an accusation, it's a confession. I mean, you've heard that before, but here's a case where it sounds like they were doing it back then too, to some degree. And these ideas that communism and socialism are things that need to be condemned. I think that's step one of this fight, because communism and socialism, they're just really legitimate political views that have been outlawed or banned or ostracized from, they haven't been banned, but they effectively have been banned from US discourse. And it shouldn't be that way. We need all these different voices, but they have effectively shut out an entire portion of the population in terms of how they would view politics. And now we're at a place where we are now, where most of our government is criminal. because all the people who would have been able to be in place that could have actually held some of these criminals accountable are now gone. And that's what we're left with. But it's really good to see a story like this, break it down, and you can see that the pattern existed like 75 years ago or more. And the people who were doing it then are the same kind of people who are doing it now. Anyway, thank you, everybody, for watching. I'm Jayme CheeseSlice. Jayme, Gloria, they had to go. They actually went over their time normally because I think they just really enjoyed talking to the guests. But this has been another presentation of Pasta to Go. This is Left on Left, where the left laughs out loud and critiques itself to keep itself from crying. I'm Jayme CheeseSlice. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week. Have a good one, everybody. Have a good weekend.